The man she was promised to was already dead before she ever set foot in Arizona. Vivian Bennett stood on that dusty platform with a frightened 2-year-old on her hip and her last suitcase at her feet. No husband, no home, no money, and a train pulling away that was taking her last chance with it. She had crossed half a country on borrowed hope, and it had delivered her to nothing, to nowhere, to a bench in the full sun with $2.60 and a daughter who didn't understand why Mama had gone so quiet. Then hoofbeats came through the dust. A stranger on a dark bay horse removed his hat and said her name like it was something worth saying. What happened next would change everything she thought she knew about what a woman could build from nothing, and who she could become on the other side of her worst day. If this story moved you, hit like and drop the name of your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. The letter that destroyed Vivian Bennett's life arrived on a Tuesday. She remembered that detail clearly, the way you remember small, ordinary things that happen right before everything falls apart. The smell of rain coming through the kitchen window, the sound of Maisie banging a wooden spoon against the floor in the next room, the particular quality of the afternoon light as it came through the curtains and made the worn floorboards look almost golden for a moment. She'd been standing at the stove, boiling the last of the potatoes, when the landlord knocked. He didn't bother taking off his hat. 3 months, Gerald Voss said, holding the eviction notice at arm's length between 2 fingers, as though the paper itself was something he'd rather not touch. He was a heavy-set man with a thin mouth and eyes that never quite landed on whatever he was looking at, always drifting slightly to the side. I've been more than patient with you, Mrs. Bennett, more than patient. But patience doesn't pay my taxes. Vivian had known it was coming. She'd known since February, since the doctor's bill, since the week of the funeral, when she'd sat at the kitchen table and done the arithmetic 3 different times, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. Thomas had been sick for 8 months. 8 months of doctors and medicine and no wages coming in, and what little she'd managed to earn taking in laundry wasn't enough to cover rent and food both. And she'd been robbing Peter to pay Paul so long she'd forgotten which was which. Mr. Voss, she started. I'm sorry, he said, and he almost sounded it for just a second. I truly am. But I've got a family too. He left the notice on the table and closed the door quietly behind him, which was somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. Maisie toddled in from the bedroom dragging her rag doll by one arm, looked at her mother and said, Mama? It's fine, Vivian said automatically. Everything's fine. She picked up the notice and read it again, even though she'd understood it perfectly the first time. 28 days. That was what she had. 28 days to find another arrangement or be put out with whatever she could carry. She set the notice back on the table and finished cooking the potatoes. That was February. By late March, she had answered the advertisement. Awesome. The advertisement had been in the back of the Ohio Courier, sandwiched between a notice for patent medicine and an offer to purchase raw wool. It was short and oddly dignified compared to most of them, which tended toward the breathless. Rancher in the Arizona Territory, age 42, of sound character and established means, seeks respectable woman, widow preferred, for the purpose of matrimony. Correspondence invited. Must be willing to relocate. References provided upon request. Write to R. Alderman, care of Iron Hollow Post, Arizona Territory. Vivian had stared at that advertisement for 2 days before she wrote back. She wasn't naive about what she was doing. She knew what these arrangements were and what they weren't. They were not romance. They were not the sort of story a woman told her daughters with a soft smile and a faraway look. They were business agreements with an uncertain counterparty and no guarantees, entered into by women who had run out of better options. She knew that. She was not pretending otherwise, but she had Maisie to think about. That changed the arithmetic on everything. She wrote the letter. She was honest about her circumstances. Widowed, a young child, limited means, willing to work hard. She did not describe herself in flattering terms or paint her situation as something it wasn't. She simply told the truth and asked if he would still consider her. He wrote back within 3 weeks. His letter was measured, a little formal, and said exactly what it needed to say without any excess. He mentioned the ranch, the size of it, the fact that he had no children of his own, but was not opposed to them. He said his housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Paulette, had been with him 12 years and would help make the transition easier. He included a letter of reference from the county registrar attesting to his good standing. She wrote back. He wrote back. They corresponded for 6 weeks. In May, he sent the train ticket. Vivian told herself she was not frightened. She repeated this to herself with some regularity during the 17 days of preparation. The packing, the selling of what little furniture she had to cover the last of the debts, the saying of goodbyes that were shorter than she expected because she had, without realizing it, been living in this city for 3 years without putting down any real roots. The women from her church were kind. Her neighbor, Mrs. Halverston, cried a little and pressed a tin of shortbread cookies into her hands at the door. The landlord, true to his word, did not extend her another day past the deadline, but he did agree to let her leave her trunk in the hallway until the morning the train departed, which was the most generosity she'd received from him in 3 years. She told herself she was not frightened. She was frightened. On the train, Maisie sat in her lap for the first 6 hours and pressed her small face against the window glass and narrated everything she saw in the fragmentary, half-formed sentences of a 2-year-old just beginning to understand that language was something you could do with. Cows, big cows. Fast tree. Sky. Mama. Sky. Vivian held her and pointed at things and agreed that yes, that was a very big cow, and yes, the trees did seem fast from here, and yes, that was certainly the sky. It took 4 days. She slept in her seat with Maisie tucked against her side, woke with a stiff neck and a sore back, ate what little she'd packed and rationed it carefully toward the end because the dining car was beyond what her remaining money could sustain. She'd kept back enough for emergencies. Thomas had always told her to keep back a little for emergencies. She thought about Thomas more on that train than she had since the funeral. Not the sick version of him, the earlier one, the one who used to whistle while he shaved, who could never remember which cabinet the coffee tin lived in, no matter how many times she showed him, who had once spent an entire Sunday afternoon trying to fix a squeaky hinge and made it considerably worse. She thought about the ordinary weight of him, the particular way a life builds up its ordinary weight, day by day, until you stop noticing it, and then one day it's gone, and the absence of it is almost more than you can stand. She was done with grieving, or rather, she had reached the place where grief had stopped being a season and become a permanent weather. Still there, always there, but no longer the only thing there. She was going to Arizona. She was going to make it work. That was the plan. Yeah, the train arrived in Carver's Bluff at 11 in the morning. It was already hot, the kind of dry, pressing heat that seemed to come from the ground up as much as the sky down. The station was small and weathered, little more than a covered platform and a single office building with a hand-lettered sign above the door. The town beyond it looked modest but real. A street, buildings, people moving with purpose, horses tied at a rail in front of what appeared to be a general store. Vivian stepped onto the platform and stood. She looked left, then right. She shifted Maisie to her other hip. The little girl had woken up hungry and was working her way through this grievance quietly but persistently, pulling at Vivian's collar and saying hungry at regular intervals. "I know, Bug," Vivian said. "In a little while." She looked down the platform again. There were other passengers collecting their luggage, greeting people, moving away with the easy confidence of people who knew where they were going. The conductor walked past without looking at her. A porter pushed a cart of mail sacks. A dog of indeterminate breed lay in the exact center of the platform, asleep, completely indifferent to the logistics of human arrival. Vivian waited. 15 minutes passed. She knew because she kept checking the watch Thomas had left her, the one she wore on a ribbon around her neck because the chain had broken and she'd never had the money to replace it. 20 minutes. She set down her suitcase and switched Maisie to the other hip again. 30 minutes. The platform was emptying. The other arrivals were gone, dispersed into the life of the town. The porter had finished his work and gone inside. Even the dog had relocated. Vivian picked up the suitcase, walked to the station office, and knocked on the open door. A thin man in his 50s looked up from a desk stacked with papers, his reading spectacles pushed down to the end of his nose. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for a Mr. Robert Alderman. I was expecting someone to meet me. I've come from Ohio." The man's expression changed. It was a small change, barely perceptible, but she'd spent enough years reading people to catch it. The slight tightening around the eyes, the way he removed his spectacles and set them on the desk with deliberate care, as though he needed an extra moment before he had to say whatever he was about to say. "What is your name, ma'am?" he said. "Vivian Bennett. I was corresponding with Mr. Alderman about... We had an arrangement." The station master stood up. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, I'm sorry to tell you this. I am truly sorry." He paused. "Mr. Alderman passed away. About 3 weeks ago. Pneumonia came on fast. He didn't linger long." The words reached her in a peculiar order, as though they arrived separately and had to be assembled before she understood them. 3 weeks, she said. "Yes, ma'am. By the time anyone thought to contact you, I suppose it was. I don't know if word got sent or how." "It didn't," she said. "No word came." She heard herself say it. She heard herself very clearly. She heard Maisie say, "hungry," again at her shoulder. She heard the tick of the clock on the station master's wall and the distant sound of the street outside, and somewhere, absurdly, a rooster. "Is there family in the area?" the station master asked carefully. "Anyone who can." "No." She didn't have any family at all in the area. She didn't have any family anywhere who could help. That was why she'd been on the train. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Excuse me." She walked back out onto the platform. She sat on the bench at the far end, the one in the full sun, because it was the only one left, and she set the suitcase at her feet and held Maisie against her shoulder and looked out at the street and the hot sky above it. She had $2.60. She had a return ticket. No, she had the stub from her ticket, which was not the same thing. She had the clothes in the suitcase and the watch around her neck, and a daughter who was still saying "hungry" with the patient, uncomprehending persistence of a child who believed problems were temporary. She was 4 days from Ohio. She knew exactly no one in Arizona. The train she had arrived on was still at the platform, taking on water and mail, preparing for its next leg. She watched the conductor check his watch. She watched the station men move the last of the cargo. She watched the locomotive breathe its slow, mechanical breath. And then the train began to pull away. She watched it go. She kept watching until it was gone around the bend, until the sound of it had faded into the general noise of the afternoon, until there was nothing left to watch. That was when she heard the hoofbeats. They came from the west end of town, a single horse, moving at a deliberate pace, not rushing, but not ambling either. The sound grew from a distant rhythm into something real and present, and then a rider came around the corner of the depot building, and the horse, a big dark bay with white on one rear ankle, stopped at the edge of the platform with the unhurried certainty of an animal that had been told exactly where to go. The man on its back looked at her. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors without thinking about it. His face was weathered, not unpleasantly, and he wore the dust of considerable riding. He removed his hat when his eyes found her. A simple, uncalculated gesture, the kind of thing a man does without deciding to, and he held it at his side. "Mrs. Bennett?" he said. His voice was level and a little low, and contained nothing except the question. "Who's asking?" she said, because she was finished being caught off guard for one day. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. "Cole Donovan," he said. "I ride for Iron Hollow Ranch. I've been sent to meet you." "The man I was supposed to marry is dead," Vivian said. "I was told this about 45 minutes ago. Whatever you were sent to tell me or arrange on someone's behalf, I'd ask you to say it plainly, because I'm not in the mood to work my way around things." Cole Donovan looked at her for a moment. Then he reached inside his jacket and produced a folded envelope, which he extended toward her. She stood, shifted Maisie to one arm, walked over, and took it. The outside read, in a neat, firm hand, "For Mrs. Vivian Bennett, who I hope has arrived safely." She looked up. "Who wrote this?" "Mrs. Evelyn Ashcroft," he said. "She owns Iron Hollow Ranch. She knew Robert Alderman. They were neighbors, more or less. She heard what happened before you arrived, and she asked me to ride down." Vivian opened the envelope and read. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first explained the situation as Evelyn Ashcroft understood it. Robert Alderman's illness, the rapidity of his death, the apparent failure of the notification to reach Vivian before she departed. The second paragraph expressed something that read like genuine regret, not the performative kind, but the spare and practical kind. The third paragraph was an offer. I cannot undo what has happened to you, and I will not insult you by pretending I can. What I can offer is a place to rest while you consider your situation, and honest work if you choose to stay on and can find a use for what we have. I am not a charitable institution, and I would not want you to mistake this for charity. I am a practical woman, and I believe you may be one as well. I leave the decision entirely to you. If you are willing, Mr. Donovan will bring you to us safely. If not, I will understand, and I will have him give you what help he can arrange. Evelyn Ashcroft. Vivian read it twice. She looked at Cole Donovan, who was waiting with the patience of a man who is apparently comfortable with silence. How far? She said. 3 days' ride, he said. The first day's the worst. After that, the terrain opens up a little. 3 days. She looked at Maisie, who had settled against her shoulder and appeared to be considering sleep. With a 2-year-old. I know, he said. He didn't add anything to that, and she found unexpectedly that this was the right response. She looked down at the letter. She looked at the suitcase. She looked down the road where the train had gone. I have $2.60, she said. I want you to know that up front. I know that too, he said, without a trace of judgment in it. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. Give me 5 minutes to use the facilities, she said, and see if there's somewhere I can get this child something to eat before we start. There was a woman at the station who sold meat pies from a basket, 3 cents apiece. Cole bought 2 without being asked and handed one to Vivian and broke the other into pieces small enough for Maisie while Vivian was still trying to figure out how to respond to the gesture. She decided not to say anything about it, which felt right. Maisie examined the pie piece with the solemn attention she gave everything new, and then ate it in 3 bites and reached for more. She's got an appetite, Cole said. She's had a long trip. Vivian finished her own pie standing up, because there was no graceful way to sit side saddle on a bench with a toddler and a suitcase and a stranger watching. I've never ridden 3 days before. I should tell you that as well. I can ride. I'm not helpless. But I've not done anything like this. I didn't figure you had, he said. That's not a problem. What about her? She nodded at Maisie. I've got a rig on the pack horse, he said. It's not elegant, but it's safe. She'll ride in front of you. I've done longer trips with less cooperative cargo. She's not cargo, Vivian said. No, he said immediately. She isn't. That was a poor choice of words. I only meant I've managed tricky situations on the trail before. She considered him. He'd caught his mistake and corrected it without defending himself, which was more than a lot of men managed. Fair enough, she said. He tied her suitcase to the pack horse, made a brief adjustment to the arrangement, and then stood at the head of the bay while she gathered Maisie and figured out with some difficulty how to mount a horse while holding a 2-year-old. Cole did not offer to help immediately. He watched until it was clear she genuinely needed a hand, and then offered one, just a steadying hand at her elbow while she got her balance, and then stepped away again. She noticed that. She was cataloging things about this man, not because she trusted him yet, but because her ability to read people was one of the few tools she had left, and she intended to use it. They left Carver's Bluff at 12:30 in the afternoon, the sun already sitting heavy in the south, the town falling away behind them as the road narrowed and the dust thickened and the scrub stretched out on either side toward a horizon that looked like it went on forever. Maisie rode in front of Vivian with her back against her mother's chest, her eyes wide, taking in this new version of the world. After a while, she pointed at a hawk circling high above them and said with great conviction, "Bird!" "That's right," Vivian said. "Big one." "Big bird," Maisie agreed and settled back. Cole rode slightly ahead, keeping a pace that the horses could sustain and that wasn't brutal on Vivian's untrained back. He checked on them every now and then with a look over his shoulder, not hovering, just noting. When the trail narrowed, he slowed until they'd passed through, then moved ahead again. They rode in silence for a long while, and the silence wasn't comfortable exactly. But it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who didn't know each other yet, and were both perhaps all right with not rushing that. It was Vivian who finally spoke. "How long have you worked at Iron Hollow?" He considered this. "Going on 6 years." "Mrs. Ashcroft, what's she like?" Cole was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. "She's not easy," he said finally, "but she's fair, and she means what she says, which is rarer than it ought to be. She wrote that she's practical." "She is," he said. "Practical's her highest compliment. If she calls you practical, you're doing fine." Vivian thought about the letter again. "I believe you may be one as well." "She doesn't know me." "She knew what you were willing to do," Cole said. "She said a woman who'll cross the country alone with a 2-year-old to make a life for herself is either practical or desperate, and that either way she's worth meeting." Something about that landed strangely. Not badly, but with weight. "Which did she think I was?" He looked back at her. "She figured probably some of both," he said, and that was honest enough. By mid-afternoon, they had left any semblance of settled country behind. The trail became something you had to interpret rather than simply follow. A line through the brush, a series of landmarks that Cole read with the ease of a man who had done this often enough to stop needing to think about it. He pointed out a cluster of rocks that marked where they'd refill the canteens from a spring, a stretch of open ground they'd want to cross before the wind picked up toward evening. Maisie fell asleep sometime after the 3rd hour, slumping against Vivian's arm with the sudden absolute surrender of a very young child. Vivian held her against her body and kept riding. Her back was beginning to protest. She didn't say anything about it. The land out here was not beautiful in any way she had vocabulary for. It was vast and indifferent and dry, and the scale of it was genuinely disorienting. You could look ahead and see what seemed like an hour's ride, and discover it was 3 hours, or look at a ridge and think it was close, and watch it fail to arrive for the better part of an afternoon. There was a kind of honesty in that, she supposed. The land didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. She thought about what she had back in Ohio. The answer was nothing she hadn't already left. She thought about Robert Alderman, the man she'd been corresponding with for 2 months, whose letters had been careful and decent, and who had apparently died before she got there. She had never met him. She had never seen his face. She had agreed to marry a man she had never looked at, and now he was gone. And she found, to her mild shame, that what she felt was less grief than she would have expected, and more the particular panic of a plan that had failed before it started. Thomas deserved grief. This was something different. This was the feeling of a door slamming that you hadn't known you were leaning against. Cole called a stop in the late afternoon beside a dry creek bed where a few cottonwood trees provided the first real shade she'd seen since morning. He moved efficiently, unpacking what was needed, setting a fire before the light failed. Maisie woke when Vivian lifted her down from the horse and immediately wanted to investigate the creek bed, which was dry but apparently still rich with rocks. And Vivian let her explore a short radius while she got feeling back in her legs. "You can rest," Cole said, without looking up from the fire. "I've got this." "I'm fine." "I know you're fine," he said, still without looking up. "I'm not suggesting you aren't. I'm saying there's nothing for you to do right now, and you've been in a saddle for 4 hours, and you might as well rest while there's a chance." She sat. She hadn't realized quite how tired she was until she sat on the ground with her back against a cottonwood and her legs out straight and let herself stop moving. The weariness came up through her all at once, the days of train and the shock of the morning and the riding and the heat, and she sat there and felt the full weight of it settle and breathed until her chest opened up a little. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to the station." Cole looked up then. "Mrs. Ashcroft asked me to." "I know. Thank you anyway." He held her gaze for a moment, then went back to the fire. "You hungry?" "Yes," she said, "and she will be too when she's finished cataloging the entire creek bed." "I've got beans and salt pork," he said, "and biscuits, though they've been in the bag since this morning." "Old biscuits are fine," Vivian said. "We're not picky." He made food without ceremony or complaint, and she ate it leaning against the tree while Maisie ate from her lap, and the fire burned down to a steady, low glow, and the Arizona dark came on fast and total, stars appearing overhead in numbers she had genuinely never seen before. She'd grown up in cities, or near enough to them, and the sky there was a muted thing. Out here, it was something else entirely. "It's different," she said, without meaning to say it aloud. "The sky?" he said. "Yes." He looked up at it as though confirming that yes, it was still there. "You get used to it," he said. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" He thought about it. "Don't know," he said. "Both, maybe." Maisie had fallen asleep again, curled against Vivian's leg with her thumb near her mouth. She didn't suck her thumb anymore, hadn't since she was 1.5 years, but she still kept it nearby when she slept, just in case. Vivian watched her and felt the usual complicated tangle of fear and love and fierce, inarticulate responsibility that she'd been living inside for 2 years. "She does that when she's tired," Cole said. "Holds the thumb." Vivian looked at him. He was watching Maisie with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not sentimental, not intrusive, just noticing. "Her father used to do the same thing," Vivian said, and then was surprised she'd said it. She hadn't talked about Thomas to a stranger in months. Cole said nothing, but he didn't look away from the child either, and there was something in that, in the simple act of someone else looking at her daughter with any care at all, that felt unexpectedly like a lot. "I should tell you something," Cole said. He was still looking at the fire. "Go ahead." Iron Hollow isn't a big town. It's not a comfortable town, not the way you might be used to. The people there, most of them have had a hard road getting there. Evelyn runs the ranch, and the ranch more or less keeps the community running, but it's not an easy life. "I didn't expect easy," she said. "I know, but I want you to understand before we get there what you're riding into. Because easy or not, those people don't pretend to be something they're not, and they don't particularly welcome people who do." She studied the side of his face. "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you deserve to know what you're walking into, and because if you're going to turn around, better to know before we've gone 3 days out." "I'm not turning around," she said. "There's nothing to turn around to." He looked at her then, and whatever he saw on her face seemed to satisfy something he'd been uncertain about. "All right," he said, and that was the end of it. She lay down beside Maisie on the bedroll Cole had laid out for them, and she looked at the stars for a while, and she thought about the letter in her pocket and the 3 days ahead, and the woman named Evelyn Ashcroft who had described her as practical, and the man sitting across the fire from her who had ridden 2 hours to meet a stranger at a train station for no reason except that he'd been asked to. She thought about a door slamming. She thought about what you did after. Eventually, she slept. And Maisie, at some point in the night, rolled over and put her small hand on Cole Donovan's boot and slept too, and neither of them knew it until morning. She found out about the hand in the morning. Not Cole's hand, Maisie's. The little girl had apparently migrated across the bedroll in the night, the way very young children do, moving with the slow, unconscious persistence of water finding a level, until she'd ended up half against Cole's side with her fingers wrapped around his thumb. Cole had been awake already when Vivian opened her eyes, sitting up and looking at the child with the expression of a man who has found himself in a situation he doesn't quite know what to do with, but has decided, for the moment, not to move. He looked over when he heard Vivian stir. "She did that on her own," he said quietly. "I know." Vivian sat up and rubbed her face and took a moment to remember where she was. The fire was dead. The sky to the east was just beginning to separate from black into something darker than purple. "She's a walker in her sleep. She'll migrate toward any warmth." "Right," he said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Maisie stirred, let go of his thumb without waking, and rolled back toward her mother. Cole got up and started rebuilding the fire. That was how the second day began. Ichan. They broke camp before full light because Cole said the second stretch of trail was better traveled in the cooler hours of morning. He was right. Vivian could feel the difference between the air at 6 in the morning and the air at 10, and by noon she understood completely why people who lived in this country developed such respect for the hours before the sun found its height. The terrain changed through the morning. The flat scrubland of the previous afternoon gave way to something rougher. Ground that folded upward into ridgelines and dropped into arroyos that the horses navigated at angles Vivian found alarming at first, and merely unpleasant by mid-morning. Cole picked the path with the deliberate care of someone who had made mistakes out here before and learned from them, testing the ground at the edges of drops before committing the horses, choosing the longer way around when the shorter didn't look right. Maisie, wedged in front of Vivian with a strip of leather fastened loosely around both of them for security, seemed almost to enjoy the rougher going. She gripped the saddle horn with both hands and made a sound of concentrated attention when the horse scrambled up a steeper section, and then looked back at her mother afterward as though checking that she'd witnessed this remarkable thing. "Yes," Vivian said. "Very impressive." "Up," Maisie said with satisfaction. "Up indeed." Cole glanced back at the exchange and said nothing, but something in the set of his shoulders was fractionally less rigid than it had been at dawn. They stopped at mid-morning, at the spring Cole had mentioned the day before, a seep in the rock that produced a thin, cold stream into a natural basin worn smooth over years. The water was good. Cole refilled the canteens and let the horses drink while Vivian got Maisie down and let her walk the stiffness out. The little girl found a beetle and studied it for an unreasonable length of time, crouched in the dust with her nose inches from the ground. "She's curious," Cole said. "About everything," Vivian agreed. "It's exhausting and mostly wonderful." He handed her a canteen and she drank. The water was cold enough to make her teeth hurt and she didn't care. "How much further today?" she asked. 6 hours, he said. "Maybe 7. We'll make the canyon camp before dark if the weather holds." She looked at the sky. Clear, high blue, nothing moving in it. "Does it not hold sometimes?" "Sometimes it doesn't," he said, simply enough that she understood this wasn't meant to alarm her, but was simply the truth of the place. "There's a line of weather that comes off the mountains in the afternoons this time of year, usually passes. Sometimes it doesn't." "And if it doesn't?" "We find shelter and we wait," he said. "There's a formation about 2 hours on. Rock overhang. It's held before. I've used it." She nodded. She noted that he had a plan and that the plan was based on experience rather than optimism, and she filed this information away under the same general heading as the way he'd handled the fire and the spring and the path. A man who thought ahead without dramatizing it. Thomas had been a planner too, in his way. Different kind. Thomas made lists, wrote things down, liked to talk through the variables. Cole just seemed to carry the contingencies already accounted for somewhere inside him without needing to say them aloud unless asked. She didn't linger on the comparison. It felt disloyal somehow, even though she couldn't entirely say to whom. Iski. The weather did not hold. It announced itself around 2 in the afternoon as a change in the quality of the air, a drop in temperature that came from nowhere, a smell that Vivian couldn't name but that Cole apparently recognized immediately. He stopped the horses, looked south toward a ridge, and said, "All right, we move now." "What is it?" "Storm," he said. "We've got maybe 40 minutes, possibly less. The overhang's an hour at our current pace." He looked at her. "We need to go faster." "Then go faster," she said. He pushed the horses into something faster than they'd been moving, and Vivian held Maisie against her with one arm and gripped with her legs and stopped worrying about whether she was doing it correctly and just did it, which turned out to be the only real option. Maisie, sensing the change in pace and in her mother's body, went quiet and tucked her head down. The storm came in from the south with remarkable speed, and what it brought first was wind. A flat, serious wind that pushed against them with physical force and picked up the loose dirt and threw it sideways. Vivian turned her face away from it. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in what felt like minutes. The light turned a particular dirty yellow color that made the landscape look wrong, like something printed on paper that had been left in the sun. Then the rain started. Not a gentle beginning. A full, immediate downpour that soaked through Vivian's coat in about 90 seconds and turned the trail under them to a different kind of ground entirely, loose and shifting. She heard the pack horse slip on a stretch of rock and scramble, and felt her own horse adjust its stride in response. "Almost there!" Cole called back through the wind. She didn't answer. She was busy keeping Maisie against her body and keeping herself on the horse and not spending any energy on anything else. The overhang was a section of rock that jutted out from a cliff face over a shallow depression, deep enough to fit 2 horses and 2 people with some maneuvering. Cole got them under it in order. Pack horse first, tied off, then Vivian's horse, and then he stood at the edge looking out at the rain while it came down in the kind of dense, relentless sheets that make you wonder if it's ever going to stop. Vivian got down carefully, Maisie still against her, and leaned back against the rock wall. "You all right?" Cole asked without turning. "Yes," she said. "Is she?" Because Maisie had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that in a 2-year-old could mean either sleepy or frightened, and she needed to know which. She looked at her daughter's face. Maisie was watching the rain from the shelter of her mother's arms with wide, dark eyes. Not frightened, transfixed. Her expression was the pure, uncomplicated attention of a child watching something enormous for the first time. "That," Maisie said, pointing at the curtain of rain. "Yes," Vivian said, "rain. Big rain. Very big rain." Maisie considered this and seemed to find it satisfactory. She leaned back against Vivian's chest and kept watching. Cole turned around. He looked at the child's face, and then he looked at Vivian, and some piece of whatever tension he'd been carrying through the last 40 minutes came loose. "She's fine," he said, not quite a question. "She's fine," Vivian confirmed. "She's fascinated." He crouched down against the far wall of the overhang, elbows on his knees, looking out. "It'll pass in an hour," he said. 2 at most. "And then?" "Then we ride." She sat down against the rock wall with Maisie in her lap and watched the rain and thought about nothing for a while. It was the first time in several days she had stopped moving long enough for her mind to go quiet, and the quiet felt very strange, almost suspicious, like being in a room where you knew something was hidden. After a while she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you end up at Iron Hollow?" She'd been turning the question over since yesterday, since he'd offered it almost but not quite as an explanation. He fell into crime. He served time. He earned a second chance. She wasn't sure yet if she was asking for information or asking because it mattered. Maybe both. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer, she thought, but the quiet of someone deciding how. "I had a brother," he said. "Younger. 8 years younger." He looked at the rain. "His name was Danny. Our folks died when he was 11, so he came with me. I was 19. I didn't have any way to take care of him properly. Didn't have work that paid, didn't have connections, didn't have any sense, honestly. I made some bad decisions about where to get money. Danny watched me make them, and he didn't say much, but he saw it all." "What happened to him?" Cole pressed his mouth together briefly. "Fever when he was 15. Nothing to do with the choices I'd made, except..." He stopped. "Except I kept thinking, the whole time he was sick, what if I'd done something different? What if I'd been something different? Made enough to get him decent food, decent care, better situation. I didn't know if it would have mattered. I still don't. But I thought about it a lot." Vivian didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say to that. "After he died," Cole said, "I went worse for a while. Stole horses, not petty stuff. Ran a whole string of them with a pair of men I had no business being around. Got caught, which was probably the better outcome considering what the other 2 eventually came to." He paused. "I served 2 years. When I got out, I had $30 and no references, and Evelyn Ashcroft's name on a piece of paper that a prison chaplain had given me because apparently she occasionally hired men who were trying to get straight." "And she hired you?" "She interviewed me for an hour," he said. "And then she said, 'You're going to be trouble to manage,' and I said, 'Probably.' And she said, 'Fine, I'll give you 6 months, and at 6 months I'll either have you on or I won't.' And at 6 months, she took me on." "What made her decide?" He glanced at her. "She said I didn't lie to her once in the whole hour," he said. "Not about what I'd done, not about why, not about what I was likely to be like. She said she could work with a lot of things, but she couldn't work with a man who told her what she wanted to hear." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She is," he said. The rain began to lighten at the edges, and through the gray she could see the ridgeline beginning to reappear, and the yellow dirt light shifted back toward something more ordinary. Maisie had fallen asleep again, her head dropping forward, her small body entirely relaxed in the way that only children manage, perfectly trusting the thing holding them up. "I'm not telling you this so you'll trust me," Cole said quietly, so as not to wake the child. "I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you because you'll hear it in Iron Hollow eventually if you stay, and I'd rather you heard it straight." "I appreciate that," she said. And she did. They made the canyon camp as the sun was dropping, later than planned, but not by much. It was a wider, flatter spot in the lee of a sandstone wall, with a ring of old firestones that Cole had clearly used before. The ground was damp from the edges of the storm, but dry enough where they set up, and he had the fire going with the competence of long practice, while Vivian changed Maisie into the one dry set of clothing she had left in the accessible part of the suitcase. "Is everything else wet?" Cole asked. "The suitcase mostly stayed dry," she said. "I'll hang what needs drying tonight." "There's a line I can rig between those two juniper posts," he said. "It'll be cold tonight, but dry enough by morning." She handed him the damp things without ceremony, and he rigged the line while she fed Maisie the last of the biscuits with some dried fruit Cole produced from somewhere in the packs. The child ate with the focused, wordless dedication of someone very hungry, and Vivian watched her and felt the day in her bones. The riding and the rain and the overhang and the story Cole had told her about a brother dead at 15. She kept thinking about that. 15. She had known grief of her own, had learned to carry it, but there was something about the specific age of it. Not a child anymore, but not yet grown, not yet someone who had lived past the worst of what life could do, that got into her in a way she hadn't expected. Maisie reached up and patted her mother's face with one slightly sticky hand. "Mama sad?" she said. "No, Bug," Vivian said, "just tired." Maisie studied her with that particular toddler gravity, the complete absence of polite skepticism, before apparently deciding this was acceptable. She returned to the dried fruit. Cole brought her a tin of coffee without being asked, and she took it with both hands and held the warmth of it against her palms. "Thank you," she said. He sat across the fire. "You're going to be sore tomorrow." "I'm sore now." "Tomorrow will be worse," he said, with the matter-of-fact kindness of someone who would rather you know the truth than be blindsided by it. "There's a liniment in the packs if you want it in the morning." "I'll consider it," she said. They sat for a while without talking. A coyote called somewhere in the dark beyond the fire's edge, and Maisie's head came up sharply, her eyes wide. "Dog?" she said. "Something like a dog," Vivian said. "It's far away." "Far dog," Maisie said, and accepted this taxonomy and went back to her fruit. Cole made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she'd heard from him. "She does that," Vivian said. "Makes categories. She's been building her own system for the world since she could talk." "Seems like it's working," he said. "Mostly." She looked at her daughter. "Thomas used to say she was going to either be a naturalist or a judge, depending on how things went." Cole looked up. The name had weight in the air between them. Not awkward, just present. "What was he like?" he said, and the question was careful, not prying. Vivian thought about it. "Steady," she said finally. "He was not a spectacular man in any way that the world would notice, but he was steady, and that's a thing I didn't understand the value of until I was without it." "That's a lot, actually." "It is," she said. "It really is." The fire settled and popped. Maisie had abandoned the fruit and crawled into her mother's lap, and Vivian could feel the child going slack with sleep, the weight of her increasing incrementally as consciousness withdrew. "She gonna walk again tonight?" Cole asked. "Probably not. She did it last night because she was overtired." She looked across the fire at him. "Did it bother you? Waking up like that?" He considered this with apparent seriousness. "No," he said. "It didn't." A pause. "I didn't want to move and wake her." Vivian looked at him carefully. He said it plainly, without any self-consciousness about the admission. She thought about a man who had spent 6 years on a working ranch, after 2 years in a prison, after 2 years of bad decisions, who had presumably not spent much time with very young children, who had ridden 2 hours to meet a woman he didn't know at a train station because he'd been asked to, and who had apparently sat still in the dark rather than disturb a sleeping toddler who'd migrated across a campsite and grabbed his thumb. She decided not to say anything about it, but she filed it. The third day delivered on its promise of being different. Cole had said the terrain opened up, and it did. The arroyos and ridgelines gave way through the morning to something broader and longer visioned, a high plateau landscape that stretched in every direction with the unhurried confidence of something that had never needed to impress anyone. The light out here was different from the light she'd grown up with, harder, more direct, casting shadows with edges sharp enough to cut yourself on. Maisie, recovered from the previous day's exertions, was in high spirits and narrated the journey at length. Her commentary encompassed rocks, the sky, the horse's ears, a distant hawk, a cloud formation she described simply as big, and Cole's hat, which she had been examining with interest and which she finally reached out and touched when his horse came close enough. Cole turned his head to look at her. The hat tilted slightly. Maisie pulled her hand back with an expression of elaborate innocence. "She does that too," Vivian said. "I apologize." "It's fine," he said. He looked at Maisie. "You want to wear it?" Maisie stared at him. "Hat?" she said. "If you want," he said. She considered this offer with the gravity it deserved, and then nodded once. Cole reached up and put his hat on her head. It dropped immediately to her nose. She sat inside the brim of it with tremendous dignity. Vivian looked at this and felt something move in her chest that she was not prepared for. She looked away. "Cowboy," Maisie said from somewhere inside the hat. "What's that?" Cole said. "You cowboy," Maisie said, tipping the brim back enough to see him. "I suppose I am," he said. "My cowboy?" she said. The question landed with the particular directness of the very young, who haven't yet learned to soften the things they want to know. Cole was quiet for a half beat, just a breath of a pause. "Sure," he said. "If you like." The hat fell back down over Maisie's face. She pushed it up again with both hands and rode along in it for a good half hour, occasionally checking to confirm that yes, the cowboy was still there, and receiving confirmation each time. Vivian watched the landscape. She kept her face turned toward the horizon and let the wind do what it would with her hair, and she thought very deliberately about practical things. What the ranch might look like, what Evelyn Ashcroft's letter had said about work, what she might know how to do that would be useful. She did not think about what she had just seen in Cole Donovan's face when a 2-year-old had called him hers. She thought about it anyway, which was the problem with practical people. You could decide what to think about, and the thinking would do what it wanted, regardless. They came to Iron Hollow in the late afternoon. It appeared first as a smudge of smoke against the southern sky, then as shapes at the base of a long slope. Buildings, she could tell, a cluster of them around a wider, lower structure that must be the main house. Fields, a fence line. The movement of cattle in the distance, nothing dramatic in its appearance, nothing that announced itself as a destination. And yet her heart was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she pressed her lips together and made herself breathe evenly while the horse picked its way down the slope toward the valley floor. Cole pulled up alongside her. "There it is," he said. "How many people?" 30-some permanent. People come and go with the seasons. He paused. "It's not what most people picture." "I stopped picturing things," she said, somewhere around the second day. He looked at her sidelong. "That's probably the right approach." "Is there going to be anyone who objects to us arriving?" she said. "To me arriving, I mean, given the circumstances. Given that I was supposed to come as someone's wife." "There might be some talk," he said honestly. "Evelyn will handle it." "I'd rather handle my own talk." "I know," he said, "but let Evelyn set the ground first. She knows how." There was something in how he said it, not patronizing, not dismissive, but simply the confidence of experience, that made her decide to take the advice. Just this once. Just until she understood the territory. Maisie, who had surrendered the hat back to its owner sometime during the downhill stretch, and had been quiet for the last half hour with the heavy-lidded look of approaching sleep, suddenly sat up straight when she saw the buildings. "There?" she said. "There," Vivian said. "Stay there?" "For a while," Vivian said. "Yes." Maisie looked at the settlement below for a long moment, considering. Then she looked at Cole. Cowboy come? She said. He glanced over. I live there, he said. So yes. She seemed to find this arrangement acceptable. She settled back against her mother's arm. They rode the rest of the way down in silence, the three of them, the horses tired and the light going gold and low, and at the gate of Iron Hollow Ranch a woman was standing. She was somewhere in her 60s, with gray-shot hair pinned back under a hat and the straight spine of someone who had never decided to slump. She watched them come down the last stretch of trail with an expression that didn't give away much. But when they pulled up at the gate and Vivian looked down at her, the woman said, without preamble, Mrs. Bennett, I'm glad you got here. Not I'm glad you came. Not a social grace. I'm glad you got here. As though the journey itself was the accomplishment, which, Vivian thought, it was. Mrs. Ashcroft, Vivian said, thank you for the letter. The older woman's eyes moved to Maisie, who looked back at her with the unguarded curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't staring. This must be Maisie, Evelyn said. It is, Vivian said. Evelyn held out one hand toward the child. Maisie examined it, then reached out and grabbed two of the offered fingers with her whole fist, which was apparently the greeting she'd decided on. Something in Evelyn Ashcroft's expression shifted. It was small enough that you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. Just a slight softening at the eyes, there and then gone. Well, she said, looking back up at Vivian, let's get you both inside. Cole was already dismounting, reaching for the horses. Vivian got herself down. Stiffer than yesterday, considerably stiffer. Cole had been right about that. And she lifted Maisie and set her on the ground and stood in the dirt of Iron Hollow with her suitcase waiting on the pack horse and the sun going down over the roof of a house she'd never been in and a future that had no shape she could yet identify. Maisie reached up and took her hand, and then Maisie reached the other hand back without looking toward Cole, who was standing behind them with the horses. He went still. Then he took her hand. The three of them stood like that for a moment, just the length of a breath, before Evelyn Ashcroft said, Come on then, and turned toward the house, and the moment broke, and they followed. The first week at Iron Hollow was the hardest, not because the people were unkind, most of them weren't. Not because the work was overwhelming, it wasn't yet. Not in the first days when Evelyn was still showing her the shape of the place, walking her through the ranch house and the outbuildings, and the small cluster of homes and structures that made up the settlement proper. It was hard because Vivian was living in the space between what she'd expected and what she'd found, and that space had no name and no map, and she was trying to navigate it while also making sure Maisie ate enough and slept enough and didn't wander into the horse paddock unaccompanied, which she attempted every single morning with the focused determination of a child who had decided horses were her primary interest. She's going to be trouble, said Mrs. Paulette, Evelyn's housekeeper, watching Maisie press her face between the fence rails and address the nearest horse in a language that was approximately half English and half something she appeared to have invented herself. She's already trouble, Vivian said. I've made my peace with it. Mrs. Paulette laughed, a short, abrupt sound, like a door opening. She was a small woman in her 50s, Tahana by birth, with work-hardened hands and an expression that was generally skeptical until it wasn't, and then it changed so completely it was startling. She'd been suspicious of Vivian at first, in the way that people who have helped build something are suspicious of anyone new coming into it. She showed it through excess efficiency, arriving with exactly what Vivian needed before she asked, which might have been generosity, but in the early days felt more like a reminder that she already knew where everything was, and Vivian didn't. Vivian understood this. She'd have done the same. By the fourth day, they'd reached an accommodation, wordless and practical, the way working arrangements between competent women usually did, an understanding of who handled what, and a mutual decision to stay out of each other's way in the ways that mattered. The settlement had 31 permanent residents by Vivian's count. She counted because it was her nature to take stock, to understand a place by its people before she understood it by anything else. There were 7 family units, ranging from a young couple who'd arrived from Tennessee the previous winter to the Reinhold family, 4 adults and 6 children across 2 generations, German immigrants who'd been in the valley nearly as long as Evelyn herself. There were several single men who worked the ranch, including Cole, who occupied a small separate bunkhouse at the east end of the property that he appeared to share with a man named Dix, and a rotating arrangement of ranch hands who came and went with seasonal work. There were also, Vivian noticed, a number of people who had arrived at Iron Hollow with some version of what she had: a broken arrangement, a closed door, a need that had no other address. A widow named Kara Finch, who'd come 3 years ago after losing her farm to debt, and now ran the settlement's only small trading store. A former mining man named Gregor, who'd lost 2 fingers in his occupation in the same accident and now did carpentry and repairs. A girl of about 17 called Nettie, origin unspecified, who worked in the main kitchen and spoke to almost no one and watched everything. Evelyn had not built a charitable institution. She'd built something more complicated than that. A place with standards and expectations and real work, where people paid their way in labor or skill or both, and where the fact that you'd had a hard road was neither a mark against you nor an excuse to stop. But she had also, quietly and without advertising it, created a thing that had room for people who needed room. Vivian recognized it, and it settled something in her chest she hadn't known was still unsettled. She met Harlan Geddes on the 6th day. He arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with 2 men she didn't recognize in a manner that announced itself before he opened his mouth. The particular carriage of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, well-dressed for the territory in a way that looked deliberate, with a neat gray mustache and the kind of hands that hadn't done physical labor in a very long time. Vivian was crossing the yard with Maisie when he rode in, and she stepped back to let the horses pass, and he looked at her as he went by with the quick, assessing look of a man pricing things. She didn't like it, but she cataloged it, the way she cataloged everything, and kept walking. She asked Mrs. Paulette about him that evening. Geddes, Mrs. Paulette said, and the name came out of her differently than other names, clipped, a little careful. He runs the crossbar operation, 20 miles east, big cattle concern, bigger money. She was quiet for a moment, rolling out pastry with the focused efficiency she brought to every task. He's been wanting this valley for 3 years. Wanting it how? Buying it would be his preference, she said. He's made offers. Evelyn has declined. And when she declines? Mrs. Paulette pressed the pastry flat with more force than was strictly necessary. Then he finds other methods, she said. He's very creative about methods. Vivian thought about this. What kind of methods? Water rights last time. He filed a claim on the upper creek that would have diverted our flow by 2/3. Evelyn contested it, took 8 months, cost her money she didn't have easy. She lifted the pastry and laid it in the tin. Before that, there was an issue with the cattle count at the territorial registry that suddenly showed Iron Hollow short of what our records showed, which would have affected the grazing permits. She glanced at Vivian. Both times it resolved. Both times it cost. He's wearing her down, Vivian said. He thinks so, Mrs. Paulette said. Whether he's right is another question. She found out what Evelyn wanted to tell her on day 8. They were sitting in Evelyn's office, a room that was almost aggressively functional, every surface occupied by papers or ledgers or maps, with one small window that looked out toward the East Ridge. Evelyn sat behind the desk, and Vivian sat across from it, and Maisie sat on the floor between them, examining a tin of buttons that Evelyn had produced from somewhere, which suggested either that she'd done this before or that she was a woman who was prepared for children on a contingency basis. I want to tell you about Millhaven, Evelyn said. Millhaven, as Evelyn described it, was a town 15 miles north, larger than Iron Hollow, with a proper main street and a hotel and a stage line, and crucially, a school that had been operating since 1881. The schoolmaster had recently taken a position in Tucson. The town council was looking for a replacement. You taught, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. For 3 years, Vivian said. Before I married. They'd pay you a proper wage, Evelyn said. Not extravagant, but enough. You could rent rooms there. They've got a woman who boards teachers. Decent situation, from what I understand. She folded her hands on the desk. Maisie could grow up in a town with other children, proper amenities, a more settled life. Vivian was quiet. It's a better situation than what I can offer you here, Evelyn said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not pretending otherwise. Why are you telling me this? Vivian said. You didn't have to find that for me. You didn't have to look. No, Evelyn said. I didn't have to. So why? Evelyn looked at her steadily. Because you came here under a false arrangement and you're making the best of it with more grace than most people would manage. And I'm not in the habit of watching people do that and then not telling them when a door opens. Vivian looked out the window at the East Ridge. She thought about Millhaven, a main street, a hotel, a school with a position in it, proper wages, rooms to rent. She thought about the shape of it, which was the shape of something reasonable and stable and achievable. She thought about Maisie growing up in a town with other children and a boarding woman who was decent, according to Evelyn Ashcroft, who was not a woman who used words like decent without meaning them. She thought about Iron Hollow, the 31 people, the Reinhold children who ran around the yard in the mornings, Nettie in the kitchen who watched everything and spoke to almost no one, the housekeeper who was slowly, carefully deciding whether to like her, the woman behind this desk who had written a letter and sent a man to a train station so that a stranger with a 2-year-old wouldn't be left in the dust without a hand. She thought about Cole Donovan telling a sleeping child that, yes, sure, she could call him hers. Iron Hollow doesn't have a school, Vivian said. No, Evelyn said, it doesn't. The Reinhold children, the youngest 4 are school age, and Dix's nephew, he arrived last month, and the Finch boy. She'd been counting, she realized, even before she knew she was counting. That's at least 8 children in this settlement who have no schooling accessible to them. Evelyn was watching her carefully. Is there a building? Vivian said. Something that could serve, even temporarily? There's the old grain barn at the south end, Evelyn said slowly. It hasn't been used for grain in 2 years. It's sound enough. It would need work. It would. Light, Vivian said. You'd need to cut windows on the south wall, and proper flooring. You can't teach children on dirt, and some manner of heating for the winter. She heard herself saying this and almost stopped because she had not actually decided anything yet, and here she was already planning structural modifications to a barn she hadn't seen. I'm thinking aloud, she said. I haven't. You've decided, Evelyn said quietly. Vivian looked at her. You decided somewhere in the middle of that list, Evelyn said, and you're giving yourself time to catch up to it, which is sensible. She paused. Millhaven is still there if you change your mind. The offer won't evaporate immediately. I know, Vivian said, but I won't change my mind. She didn't entirely know why this was true, but it was, and she'd learned enough to trust the certainty when it arrived. I'd like to see the barn. Evelyn's expression did the thing it had done the first evening at the gate. That small, specific shift that came and went too fast to be called a smile, but wasn't anything else either. After lunch, she said. Maisie looked up from her buttons. Barn? She said. Yes, Vivian told her. We're going to look at a barn. Horses? Maisie said, brightening. No horses in this barn, Vivian said. Maisie's face went through several stages of reconsideration. Okay, she said, finally, with the magnanimity of someone making a concession, and went back to the buttons. The news moved through Iron Hollow the way news moved through any small, closed community, faster than seemed physically possible, and with several additions the original statement hadn't contained. By the time Vivian came back from looking at the south barn with a list of materials in her head and dirt on her boots, at least 4 people had already heard that she was staying and building a school, and Kara Finch at the trading store told her she thought it was the best idea anyone's had in 3 years. And old Gregor the carpenter stopped her in the yard to say that he could do the windows. He'd cut windows before. He knew what he was doing. I appreciate that, she said. I'll need to talk to Mrs. Ashcroft about materials first. You talk to her, Gregor said. I'll be ready. She found Cole at the east fence, mending a section that had come loose from its post. He looked up when she came over and waited. I'm staying, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. I heard. What do you think? He seemed genuinely surprised she'd asked. He looked back at the fence post, set another nail. I think it's what you want to do, he said. That's not what I asked. He drove the nail in. Then he turned to look at her properly. I think those kids need schooling, he said. I think you're someone who can teach, and I think... He paused. I think you'd have been miserable in Millhaven. You would have done it well, but you'd have been miserable. She wasn't expecting that. Why? Because there's nothing to build there, he said. It's already built, and you're someone who needs to build something. She stood with that for a moment. It was an accurate thing to say, and she wasn't sure she'd known it about herself until he said it. The barn needs windows cut, she said, and flooring. I know, he said. Gregor already came and found me. She almost smiled. Of course he did. But the trouble started 4 days later, and it came, as trouble often does, from a direction she hadn't been watching closely enough. She was in the trading store with Maisie when she overheard it. Two of the ranch hands from Geddes' crossbar operation, in town for supplies, talking at the counter in the unhurried way of men who either didn't notice women nearby or didn't care. One of them was saying that the old deed survey on the valley had some questions in it, which was a thing their boss had been looking into, and that the Territorial Land Office in Tucson had some irregularities in the filing from the original grant, which meant that the whole claim might be subject to review, which meant that if someone with the resources to pursue it properly brought the right case to the right office. He stopped talking when he noticed Vivian looking at him. He didn't look embarrassed. He just stopped. She walked back to the ranch and told Evelyn what she'd heard. Evelyn's face didn't change. That in itself told Vivian something. The absence of surprise meant this wasn't new. He's known about the survey question for 6 months, Evelyn said. My lawyer in Tucson is working on it. She paused. It's not nothing. The original grant had 2 surveyors who filed slightly different boundary descriptions, and there's a legitimate question about which one is controlling. Geddes has someone in the land office who is... She stopped. Sympathetic to his interpretation. How much land? Vivian said. If his reading holds, roughly 1/3 of the valley falls outside our documented claim, including the south fields, including the creek access. She said this flatly, the way someone describes a weather forecast, including most of what makes this place viable. Vivian sat down across from the desk. What does your lawyer say? He says we have a case. He also says it will be expensive and long, and that Geddes likely has more resources to sustain it. She looked at Vivian. I'm telling you this because you asked, and because you live here now, and you ought to know what you're living in. Is there anything that can be done outside the legal process? Evelyn's eyes sharpened slightly. What are you thinking? I don't know yet, Vivian said, but I'm thinking. She was still thinking about it 3 days later when Geddes came back. This time he came alone without the 2 men, and he asked at the gate for Mrs. Ashcroft. And Vivian happened to be in the yard when he arrived, and she watched Evelyn come out and stand at the top of the porch steps, and look down at him with the expression of a woman who had made calculations and was at peace with all of them. Vivian moved closer. Not close enough to interfere, close enough to hear. Geddes made his offer. It was, he said, generous, considerably above what the land would appraise for under normal circumstances, though he didn't say normal in a way that suggested circumstances were normal. He mentioned the survey question without quite making it a threat. He talked about the difficulty of the legal process, the cost of it, the uncertainty. Evelyn let him finish. Mr. Geddes, she said, I have declined your offers before. I am declining this one. I would like you to get off my property. He looked up at her from the yard, and his expression was the kind that men put on when they've decided to be patient because they believe time is on their side. Evelyn, he said, not Mrs. Ashcroft, which was its own small aggression. You've got 30-some people depending on this ranch. That's a lot of weight to carry when the ground shifts under you. It's my weight to carry, she said. Good day? He turned to go, and his eye fell on Vivian, who was standing 10 feet away and hadn't tried to pretend she wasn't. He looked at her with the same quick assessment he'd used on his first visit. Who are you? He said. Vivian Bennett, she said. I'm the school teacher. Something moved in his face. Amusement, maybe, the kind that sits right next to contempt. Didn't know Iron Hollow had a school. It will, she said. He looked at her for another moment, then mounted his horse and rode out without looking back. The school was 3 weeks from ready by Gregor's estimate when everything broke open. Cole came back from a supply run to Carver's Bluff with news that 2 families from the settlement's eastern edge had received papers, official territorial documents citing the survey dispute and recommending that structures built within the contested boundary be vacated pending resolution. The Reinhold family's 2 eastern outbuildings were inside the contested line. So was the small house where Kara Finch's store operated, and the house of the young Tennessee couple, and Gregor's workshop. The settlement came together that evening in the main ranch house. All 31 people crammed into a space built for half that, some standing in the doorway, some sitting on the stairs. The noise of it was considerable. The mix of English and German and Spanish that was the usual language of the valley, and the children had been put in Evelyn's office with Maisie and the tin of buttons and strict instructions to stay there. Cole was near the back wall. Vivian was near the front beside Evelyn. People were frightened, and frightened people said things in every direction. Mr. Reinhold wanted to know what the papers meant legally. Kara Finch wanted to know what would happen to the store. 3 of the ranch hands were talking about Geddes in a register that was heading somewhere that wouldn't help. Dix, who was a thoughtful and generally quiet man, was trying to get a word in and not quite managing it. Evelyn let it run for about 5 minutes. Then she said, clearly and without raising her voice, "Enough." The room came down. "These papers are a legal tactic," she said, "not a final ruling. They mean Geddes has filed with the territorial office to initiate a boundary review. They do not mean anyone is required to vacate anything today or next week. My lawyer has been contacted and will file a counter-response by Thursday." She looked around the room. "I understand you're frightened. I understand you have reason. I am not standing here telling you this is nothing, because it isn't. It is a real threat, and we need to address it as one." Silence. Then a man near the back, one of the newer hands, a man named Pratt, who'd been at Iron Hollow only 2 months, said, "The man's got money, and he's got someone in the land office. How do we fight that?" "Carefully," Evelyn said, "and with better documentation than he has." "We have records," Dix said. "We've got the original grant filings, the water rights papers, the census registrations." "His surveyor is disputing the boundary descriptions," Evelyn said. "Paper against paper." Vivian had been listening. She'd been listening, and a thing had been assembling itself in her mind. Not neatly, not all at once, but piece by piece, the way she'd assembled the list of barn modifications before she knew she was deciding to stay. "May I say something?" she said. The room looked at her. She was still relatively new to them, which meant some faces were attentive and some were reserved, and she was going to have to be concise and clear and not waste the moment. "What Geddes has in the land office is one person," she said. "Someone who reads the documents his way and represents that reading as the official position. That's his power in this. Not the law, but the interpretation of the law by a single official." She paused. "What's the process for a boundary dispute of this kind? Evelyn, does it go before a territorial judge?" "Eventually," Evelyn said, "if it isn't resolved at the land office level. And a judge would consider what the original filings, the survey records, witness accounts of long-standing use? All of those, yes." "Then what we need," Vivian said, "is a record that's harder to argue with than a survey. We need to document everything. The structures, when they were built, who built them, the water use, the fence lines, the crop plantings, the years of continuous occupation. Not just what Evelyn's papers say, what every person in this room knows and can put their name to." She looked at the faces around her. A judge in Tucson can dismiss a disputed survey. He has a harder time dismissing 31 sworn statements from 31 people who can describe in specific detail the exact acre of ground they've been working for the last 3, 5, 10 years. The room was quiet in a different way now. "She's right," Dick said. "It's a lot of work," Gregor said. "Yes," Vivian said. "It is, but it's the kind of work we can actually do." Mr. Reinhold, who had not spoken since his initial question, said something in German to his wife. Then he said in English, "My family has been in this valley 7 years. I can tell you every fence post I set and when I set it." "That's exactly what I mean," Vivian said. She looked toward the back of the room. Cole was watching her from the wall with an expression she couldn't fully read from the distance. Not surprised, she thought, but something else. She looked away before she could spend too long trying to decode it. They worked through the night, or rather Vivian worked through the night, and various people cycled through the main room at intervals, bringing their knowledge and their papers and their memories, and she organized it, writing it down, asking the clarifying questions, making sure dates were specific and boundaries were described in terms that a legal document could use. Mrs. Paulette brought coffee at 10 and again at midnight and didn't comment on the state of the table, which was considerable. Cole came in at 11 with a survey diagram he'd made himself. A hand-drawn map of the valley, rough but spatially accurate, with notations on where each family's structure sat and their distances from the contested boundary markers. He put it on the table without preamble. "How did you know to do that?" Vivian said. "Because you were going to need it," he said. She looked at the map. It was well done, clear lines, consistent scale, the kind of thing that was useful rather than decorative. "When did you make this?" "Started after the meeting," he said. "Finished an hour ago." She looked up at him. He was tired, the lines around his eyes that she'd been learning to read. But he was steady in the way he was always steady. She'd come to understand this about him over the weeks at Iron Hollow, that he was not a man of large gestures, and that the small, consistent ones were therefore worth more. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We don't know if it works." "I know," she said. "Thank you anyway." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the table full of notes and the diagram and the stacks of papers Evelyn had pulled from her filing cabinets, and he said, "What else do you need?" "Sit down," she said. "You know this land better than anyone. I need you to verify the distances on the eastern parcels." He sat down. They worked until 2 in the morning. 3 days later, one of Geddes' men came to the ranch with a message. Not official, just a verbal one, delivered at the gate by a cowhand who had the look of someone who hadn't chosen this errand. The message was that Mr. Geddes wanted to speak with Mrs. Ashcroft privately about a resolution, and that he had information relevant to certain parties at Iron Hollow that they might prefer not to become public. Evelyn sent the man away. But the word certain parties got to Cole before it got to anyone else. And it got to Vivian because she was in the barn when Cole came to find Evelyn, and she heard it. "He knows," Cole said. He said it without inflection, flat, but she could see what it cost him to say it. "About my record. He's found out." "How?" Evelyn said. "Someone talked. Or he dug." He shook his head slightly. "It doesn't matter how. He's got it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What does he plan to do with it?" "Make it public, is my guess," Cole said, "in a context that hurts as much as possible." He looked at Evelyn steadily. "I can leave. If it makes things cleaner for the fight, I can be gone before he says it." "No," Evelyn said. "Evelyn, no," she said again. "That's not how we do things here." He was quiet. Then he said, "People might not feel the same way when it comes out. The Reinholds, the Finch woman, they don't know. They've trusted me." "Then they'll decide how they feel about it when they know," Evelyn said. "That's their right. But you running isn't the answer." Vivian had been standing still in the corner of the barn. Cole turned and saw her, and his expression changed. Not into shame exactly, but into something she understood was close to it. The particular feeling of being seen in the place you'd tried hardest to move past. "You heard," he said. "I heard," she said. He nodded once, jaw set. "You haven't done anything wrong," she said. "Not here, not to these people. I've done wrong plenty of places." "That's not what I said." He looked at her with something that was difficult to hold, and she held it anyway. "When he makes it public," she said, "and he will, because that's the play. When he does, you let me say something first." "What are you going to say?" "The truth," she said. "That a man who has worked this land honestly for 6 years doesn't deserve to have his past used as a weapon against the people he works beside." She paused. "That isn't naive. That's just true." He stared at her. "You'd do that?" "Yes." "Why?" She considered the question seriously, because it deserved that. "Because it's right," she said. And because you drove 2 hours to meet a stranger at a train station and you've never once made me feel like a burden for being there. And because Maisie calls you her cowboy and she's a better judge of people than most. She stopped. Is that enough? Something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for yet. Yeah, he said quietly. That's enough. The afternoon light came through the gaps in the barn walls in long, uneven lines, and outside she could hear Maisie somewhere in the yard with Mrs. Paulette, narrating the discovery of something on the ground in the specific urgent register she used when she'd found a beetle, and the sound of it sat in Vivian's chest like something warm. Iron Hollow was not an easy life. Evelyn had been right about that. But there was a difference, she was learning, between hard and wrong, and she had not made the wrong choice. She was almost sure of it. Geddes made his move on a Thursday. He didn't send a messenger this time. He came himself with a man Vivian didn't recognize who turned out to be a territorial deputy, not from Carver's Bluff, from a county seat 2 days east, which told her something about the planning that had gone into this. The deputy carried papers. Geddes carried the expression of a man who had already decided how the afternoon was going to go. Word moved through the settlement in about 7 minutes. By the time Evelyn came out onto the porch, there were 14 people in the yard, and by the time Geddes had dismounted and stated his business, there were 22. His business was this: a formal notice of boundary dispute filed with the Territorial Land Office, combined with a secondary complaint. And this was the new piece, alleging that Iron Hollow Ranch had knowingly employed a convicted criminal in a position of trust and authority in violation of certain territorial labor statutes that applied to bonded ranch operations. The complaint named Cole Donovan specifically. It named his conviction. It named the years he'd served. Geddes read this part himself, standing in the yard, loudly enough that there was no question about who heard it. Vivian was at the edge of the crowd. She watched Cole, who was standing near the barn door, and she watched his face go through something private and controlled. The jaw tightening, the deliberate stillness of a man who has decided in advance not to react the way he wants to. She had about 45 seconds before this moment became something nobody could manage, and she used 20 of them deciding what to do with the other 25. She walked to the center of the yard. "Mr. Geddes?" she said. He turned. He recognized her. The schoolteacher, he'd said, with that particular edge of amusement. He looked at her now with the patient tolerance of a man who is certain he is winning and can afford to wait. "I'm not sure you understand how this works," she said. "You've come here with a legal document and a deputy, and you've used the occasion to publicly air personal information about a man who works here, and you've done it in a way designed to damage him in front of the people he lives beside." She looked at him evenly. "So let me be equally public about a few things." The yard was very quiet. "Cole Donovan served his sentence," she said. "He paid what the law said he owed. He has worked this ranch honestly for 6 years, and every person standing in this yard knows it because they have worked beside him, eaten at the same tables, relied on him in situations that matter." She turned slightly so she was addressing the yard as much as Geddes. "The law in this territory does not prevent a man who has served his time from working an honest job. If you have a specific statute you believe applies, I would invite you to have it reviewed by a judge who will read it in full and not in the selective way it's been described to you." The deputy shifted his weight. She noted this. "As for the land dispute," she said, turning back to Geddes, "you are correct that it is in process. What you may not know is that this community has spent the last week compiling 31 sworn statements, a detailed boundary map with cross-referenced historical notations, water use records going back 11 years, and construction documentation for every structure in this valley." She paused. "We've sent copies to the Territorial Land Office, the circuit judge in Tucson, and 2 newspapers." Geddes' expression did something she found satisfying. Not much, just a small shift in the confidence there, a slight recalibration. "The newspapers," she added, "were interested specifically in the nature of the relationship between Crossbar Ranch and the land office official currently handling this filing." This was a calculated risk. She had no newspapers. She had written letters to 2 newspapers, explaining the situation and asking for their interest, and she did not know yet whether they had any interest at all. But she had written the letters, and the letters had been sent. and both of those things were true. Geddes looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who was very good at reading situations, and she could see him reading this one, adjusting his estimate of it. "You're the school teacher," he said finally. "I am," she said. "You've been here what? A month?" "Long enough," she said. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Evelyn, who was standing on the porch with the expression of someone watching a card game play out that she'd had a hand in setting up. He looked back at Vivian. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," she said, "but today is." He stood in the yard for another moment, just long enough that it didn't look like retreat. And then he mounted his horse, and he and the deputy rode out. The yard held its silence until the sound of hooves had faded, and then it did not hold it anymore. The reaction was not uniform, and Vivian hadn't expected it to be. Most of the settlement, the Reinholdts, Dix, Kara Finch, the Tennessee couple, Gregor, even Nettie, who rarely showed what she thought about anything, received the information about Cole's past with the equanimity of people who had come to this valley carrying their own difficult histories and were not inclined to throw stones. Mr. Reinhold said, in his direct way, that he had known men in Germany who had done foolish things young and become decent men, and that this seemed like a similar case, and that the question for him was whether Cole had been honest in his dealings at Iron Hollow, and since the answer to that was clearly yes, he didn't see the problem. Two of the ranch hands were cooler. One of them, Pratt, the newer one who had spoken up at the community meeting, came to Cole directly the following morning and said he wasn't sure how he felt about it, which was at least honest. The other said nothing to Cole, but his distance was visible. Cole bore all of it without complaint. He went about his work. He didn't seek reassurance, and he didn't avoid the people who were uncertain, which Vivian thought was the right instinct, though she understood it cost him. What she hadn't anticipated was how it would settle with her, not the revelation itself, which she'd already known and made her peace with, but the experience of standing in that yard and saying it in public. She'd been composed out there. She'd been deliberate. But afterward, in the quiet of the room she shared with Maisie, when the day had wound down and the child was asleep and the settlement was still, she sat on the edge of her bed and her hands were shaking. Not from fear. She couldn't entirely name what it was. The delayed physical response to something her body had apparently recognized as dangerous, even when her mind was too busy to notice. She sat with it until it passed, which took a while. Mrs. Paulette knocked at 9 in the evening with tea she hadn't asked for. "You did a good thing today," Mrs. Paulette said, setting the cup on the small table by the window. "I don't know yet if it worked," Vivian said. "That's not what I said." She looked at Vivian with her direct, appraising gaze. "You did a good thing. Whether it works is a separate question." She paused at the door. "He knows too, by the way, what you did. He's not the kind of man who says much about it, but he knows." She left before Vivian had to find an answer for that. The answer to the newspaper letters came 11 days later. A journalist from the Tucson Territorial Examiner named Harrison Flood arrived in Iron Hollow on a Wednesday with a notebook and the particular energy of a man who had been handed something he hadn't expected and was moving fast before it cooled. He was young, younger than Vivian had pictured, early 30s at most, with ink-stained fingers and a habit of writing while people were still talking that they generally found rude but that she found efficient. He had received her letter. He had, independently, received a separate tip from someone in Tucson, he wouldn't say who, about the land office relationship. He had already spoken to 2 former Crossbar employees who were willing to give their names to statements about how Geddes operated. "The land office man," Flood said, sitting at Evelyn's kitchen table with his notebook open. "His name is Cotter. He's been in that position for 4 years. In those 4 years, 3 separate boundary disputes in this county have gone in favor of Crossbar Ranch. 2 of those decisions were overturned on appeal, but both appeals took more than a year." He looked up from his notes. "You understand what that means in practical terms. Even if you win, you can be put through enough process that you run out of money or will before the ruling comes." "We understand," Evelyn said. "What I need from you," he said, "is the documentation. All of it. Not copies. I need to see the originals, read them myself, and note the specifics. If this goes to print, it needs to be something nobody can pick apart for accuracy." They spent 2 days with him. Vivian organized the documentation. It was hers, she'd built it. She knew where everything was and what it meant, and Flood went through it with the methodical patience of someone doing real work. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. He pushed back when something was unclear and accepted the clarification without resentment. Cole gave a statement. He didn't want to. Vivian could see that. But he sat down with Flood on the second afternoon and said what he knew about the fence lines and the water access and the years of operation. And at the end of it, Flood said, "For what it's worth, you're a credible witness." And Cole said, "That's not what I was worried about." And Flood, to his credit, understood what he meant and wrote it down. "What were you worried about?" Vivian asked Cole afterward, when Flood had gone to sleep in the room Evelyn had given him. They were sitting on the fence rail outside the barn in the last of the evening light. Maisie had been put to bed an hour earlier and had gone down without a fight for once, which usually meant the next morning would make up for it. "That it would make things worse for Evelyn," Cole said. "Putting my name in a newspaper. Convicted criminal, current employee. He could use that." "He already used it," she said. "In the yard, in front of everyone." "A newspaper is wider than a yard." "Yes," she said, "but a newspaper also tells a story. Flood's story isn't about your conviction. It's about Geddes and Cotter and 3 years of manipulated boundary disputes." She looked at him. "Your name is in the story because you're someone who works here and knows the land. That's all." He was quiet for a moment. "You trust this reporter?" "I trust that he wants a good story more than he wants to be fair to Geddes," she said. "That's enough." Cole almost laughed. "That's a practical way to look at it." "Evelyn says practical is a compliment," she said. "She's right," he said. They sat for a while in the falling dark, and the horses moved in the paddock behind them, and somewhere across the settlement a child was being told it was time to come inside, and the sound of it, the ordinary evening sound of a place where people lived, settled around them like something she hadn't known she was waiting for. "Can I ask you something?" Cole said. "Go ahead." "Why did you stay?" He said it carefully, like he'd been turning the question over for a while. "Evelyn offered you Millhaven. Better wages, easier situation. You had every reason to take it." He looked at the paddock. "You'd been here, what, 8 days?" "9, she said. 9. And you decided to stay and build a school in a barn in a settlement that was already in a land fight." "Yes." "Why?" She thought about how to answer honestly. "Because Millhaven was already built," she said, "and I needed—" She stopped, then started again. "When Thomas died, I lost the thing that was mine, the life we'd been building. I needed to build something again, not take over something that already existed. Build it." She looked at the barn. "This needed building." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not the only reason," he said. She looked at him. "You also stayed because of the people," he said. "The Reinholdts, Mrs. Paulette, Nettie, all of them." "Yes," she said. "That too." He looked at her directly, which he didn't always do. He more often came at things sidelong, as though the direct line was too exposed. "And?" he said. She knew what he was asking. She sat with it for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wasn't sure she was ready to say it out loud, and that uncertainty was itself information. "And you were here," she said. "That was part of it." He held her gaze. The evening light was almost gone. "Okay," he said quietly. And that was all. But the way he said it carried more than the word. Harrison Flood's piece ran in the Territorial Examiner 16 days later. Evelyn got the paper on a Friday, brought in from Carver's Bluff with the week's supply run. She read it at the kitchen table without changing expression, which by now Vivian understood meant she was feeling something considerable. The story was thorough. It named Cotter at the land office, documented the 3 previous boundary decisions, quoted 2 former Crossbar employees by name, and included a detailed account of the Iron Hollow situation. The competing survey descriptions, the tactical legal filings, the community's documentation response. It also quoted Vivian, which she hadn't expected, a passage from the yard confrontation that Flood had reconstructed from 3 witnesses, including the part about the territorial labor statute and the newspapers. "She said it in front of 30 people," one settlement resident told this correspondent, "and she was right about every word." Evelyn set the paper on the table and looked at Vivian. "They're going to know this came from you," she said. "I know. Geddes is going to be very angry." "I know that too." Evelyn looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "Good," she said, and poured them both coffee. Them. The legal response came 2 weeks after the article. The Territorial Land Office in Tucson announced that the boundary dispute filing for Iron Hollow Valley would be referred to an independent review panel rather than processed through the standard office procedure, citing the appearance of conflict of interest requiring further examination. Cotter, the land office official, was placed on administrative leave pending that examination. It wasn't a victory. Evelyn's lawyer was careful to explain this. The dispute itself was still open. The independent review would take time, and nothing was guaranteed. But the specific mechanism Geddes had been using, the sympathetic official, the tilted process, had been disrupted, and disrupting it changed the arithmetic considerably. Geddes sent no message, made no appearance. The silence from the crossbar operation had a different quality now than it had before, less patient and more watchful, and Vivian was not naive enough to think the fight was over. But the immediate pressure had lifted, and 31 people who had been braced against something felt the tension go out of their shoulders by degrees. The school opened on a Tuesday in October. Gregor had cut 3 windows in the south wall and replaced the floor with planks he'd sourced from a salvage in Carver's Bluff, and the result was a room that was neither elegant nor warm enough for December, but was clean and bright and real. Vivian had built 8 desks with Cole's help. Rough things, functional rather than fine, with the nails slightly too visible and one of them uneven on its legs until Cole shimmed it with a folded piece of leather. She'd written to 3 different sources for primers and received 2 responses. The books she had weren't enough, so she'd written out lesson pages by hand in the evenings, and Evelyn had paid to have them copied at the printer in Carver's Bluff. 8 children arrived on the first morning. 9, counting Maisie, who was technically too young but who sat in the back with her slate and copied letters with an expression of ferocious concentration. The Reinhold children came in together, 4 of them, ranging from 7 to 12, with their hair combed and their boots clean in a way that suggested their grandmother had exerted considerable effort that morning. Dix's nephew was 8 and terrified, and sat as close to the door as he could manage without being outside. Kara Finch's boy was 9 and had the self-possessed manner of a child who has spent a lot of time around adults. A girl named Ada from one of the ranch hand families sat in the middle and looked around the room with wide, careful eyes. Vivian stood at the front of the room and looked at them. She had been in front of classrooms before. She had taught for 3 years before she married Thomas, in a proper schoolhouse in Columbus with 40 students and a full set of McGuffey readers and a stove that worked reliably. This was 8 children in a converted barn with 3 south windows and insufficient books and 1 student who was going to need a nap by noon. It was not the same. And it was the same underneath. The particular quality of attention that a room of children produces when they're not sure yet what to expect, which is total and enormous and slightly terrifying, and which she loved more than she'd been able to explain to anyone who hadn't stood in front of it. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Bennett. We're going to start with letters." Cole came to the school that first afternoon, after the children had gone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room. The desks, the slates lined up, Maisie's small handprints on the chalkboard from where she'd helped clean it by the simple method of putting her hands flat on it repeatedly. "How was it?" he said. "Dix's nephew cried for 20 minutes and then did the best penmanship in the room," she said, without looking up from the papers she was sorting. The oldest Reinhold girl already knows her multiplication tables. Maisie ate a piece of chalk. "Is that—" "She's fine," Vivian said. "She didn't eat much of it." He stepped inside. He looked at the desk in the corner, the uneven one he'd shimmed, and checked the leather piece was still in place. It was. "Gregor said he can come back and level that properly. It's fine for now," she said. "We have bigger priorities." She looked up. "Thank you for helping build this." "I put boards on a floor," he said. "That's not—" "Cole?" she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said again, and meant the entirety of it. The boards and the nails and the 2 weeks of evenings and the survey diagram and the trip to Carver's Bluff and the second conversation at the overhang in the storm and the hat on Maisie's head on the third day of the trail, and all of it trailing back to a dusty platform and a man who had removed his hat and said her name like it mattered. He understood what she meant. She could see that he did. "You're welcome," he said. November came in cold and the school kept going, which was not guaranteed. Vivian had been told by Dix that the previous attempt to establish schooling, 2 winters earlier, had lasted 6 weeks before the weather and the workload defeated it. She was determined that this would not be the same outcome, and she drove it partly by stubbornness and partly by the pragmatic discovery that in a frontier settlement, the school became useful to adults almost as quickly as to children. Parents came in the evenings to work on reading and sums. Kara Finch came on Thursday nights to work on the bookkeeping skills she'd been managing by instinct for 3 years. Even Gregor came once, stiffly, and worked on writing his name in full rather than initialing documents, which he had been doing since his fingers made detailed writing difficult. She didn't comment on why he wanted to learn, she just taught him. Nettie, the girl from the kitchen who spoke to almost no one, appeared on a Wednesday evening and stood in the doorway for a long time before Vivian looked up and said simply, "Come in if you like." And Nettie came in and sat in the back row, and they spent 2 hours on reading without discussing why she'd come or what had kept her away before. She came back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. Maisie, whose presence at the school was officially unofficial, was nonetheless learning at a pace that startled Vivian, who had experience with young children and knew the range. The girl could write her full name by November and was working on the alphabet with an intensity that suggested she had decided letters were a personal project and was pursuing them accordingly. She also had definite opinions about the running of the classroom that she expressed without being asked, and the older children found her alternately amusing and maddening, which Vivian thought was probably good practice for all parties. Cole came on Saturdays to check the stove and the walls and the roof, which were all developing the minor complaints of a building being used in ways it hadn't been designed for. He was quiet about it, arrived, worked, left, and she had stopped trying to explain to herself why she found this comforting and accepted that she did. One Saturday in late November, Maisie intercepted him at the door before he could get to the stove. "Sit," Maisie said, pointing at the desk in the front row. He looked at Vivian. She shrugged because she had nothing to do with this. He sat in the front row desk, which was not built for a man his size, and showed this. Maisie positioned herself at the chalkboard with the authority of someone who has been observing teaching for 6 weeks and has concluded she understands it. She picked up the chalk. "Letter A," she said. She drew something on the board. It was possible, with generosity, to interpret it as an A. "That's an A," Cole said seriously. "Your turn," Maisie said, and held out the chalk. He took it. He stood at the board. He drew a careful, accurate letter A. "Good," Maisie said. "Letter B." Vivian sat at her desk in the back of the room with the week's papers and said nothing and did not look up and was quietly, helplessly happy in a way she hadn't let herself be in so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "Letter B," Cole said, beside the chalkboard, in the tone of a man doing exactly what he'd been told. "Good," Maisie told him. "Letter C." December arrived with the first real cold, and the stove in the school proved adequate but only just, and Vivian requisitioned additional wood and Evelyn approved it without comment. The land review was ongoing, slow, deliberate, the way legal processes moved, and Geddes had apparently retained a lawyer in Tucson to contest the independent panel's formation, which was itself a sign that the disruption had mattered. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no sudden resolution. The valley went about its work in winter, which was different from its work in summer but no less real, and the school continued, and the ranch continued, and the community of 31 people continued with its accumulated frictions and loyalties and daily negotiations. One evening in mid-December, after the school had closed and Maisie was down and the settlement had gone quiet, Vivian was walking back from returning a book to Evelyn's office when she found Cole at the east fence. He was not mending it this time. He was just standing at it, looking out toward the dark of the valley, and she recognized in his posture the specific stillness of a man thinking something that was taking a while. She stopped beside him. "What is it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Evelyn offered me a parcel." She turned to look at him. "What kind of parcel?" "Land," he said. "Northeast corner of the valley, against the ridge. 20 acres, good water access. She said if the boundary review comes out the way her lawyer expects, the title will be clean." He paused. "She said it's time I had something of my own." "She's right," Vivian said. "I know," he said. "I just—" He stopped. "Just what?" He turned and looked at her directly, the way he sometimes did when he decided something was too important to approach sideways. "I'd be building something," he said. "A horse ranch. Small. Start small, but build it." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that. What I'm building and where." The cold air moved between them, and she understood what he was saying, which was not only about land. 20 acres is a good start, she said. "It is," he said, "for a start. The northeast corner gets good morning light," she said. "I've seen it from the ridge." "I know," he said. They stood at the fence in the cold, looking out at the dark valley, and she could hear the ranch settling around them, the horses, the wind, the particular quiet of a place that had been fought for, and was still standing. And she thought about a train platform in May, and a man who had removed his hat and said her name, and about 3 days on a trail that should have been impossible and hadn't been, and about a child who had migrated across a campsite in the night and taken hold of something and refused to let go. Maisie had known first. Children usually did. "Cole?" she said. "Yeah." "Maisie asked me something last week," she said. "She asked if you were going to stay." He was quiet. "I told her I thought so," Vivian said. "I told her that was a question she should probably ask you herself." He looked at her. "She'll ask," Vivian said. "Probably at the worst possible moment, the way she does everything." "I know," he said. And then, after a pause, "What would you want me to tell her?" She held his gaze. The cold was real and present, and she didn't move away from it. "The truth," she said. "Whatever it is." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark at the fence line of Iron Hollow Ranch, with the winter sky spread above them and the lights of the settlement behind them and 20 acres waiting at the northeast corner. "Then I'll tell her yes," he said. She breathed. "Okay," she said. "Good." Neither of them said anything else. They stood at the fence a while longer, close enough that the cold between them was less than it had been, and the valley was dark and still, and Iron Hollow held them both. The Boundary Review Panel issued its ruling on a Wednesday in February, and Evelyn read it twice before she said anything to anyone. Vivian was in the school when Mrs. Paulette came to the door and said simply, "Evelyn wants you." And something in the way she said it made Vivian set down the primer she was holding and tell the Reinhold girl to lead the reading exercise until she returned. She crossed the yard in the cold morning air and went into Evelyn's office and found the older woman sitting at her desk with a letter in her hands and an expression that Vivian had not seen on her face before. Not quite relief, because relief implied that the alternative had been equally possible in her mind, and Evelyn had never fully permitted that. Something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying so long, you'd stopped noticing the carrying. "The panel found in our favor," Evelyn said. "The boundary is confirmed as originally granted. Cotter's rulings on the previous filings have been referred for independent audit." She set the letter on the desk. "Geddes can appeal. He has 30 days. "Will he?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Probably not," she said. "The cost of appeal is considerable, and the panel's ruling was specific enough that an appeal would require him to argue against his own surveyor's methodology, which creates problems for him in 2 other disputes he's currently managing." She looked up. "He's not a stupid man. He'll cut his losses." Vivian sat down in the chair across the desk, the same chair she'd sat in when Evelyn had offered her Millhaven, which felt like a different era of her life. "What happens to Cotter?" "The audit will determine that," Evelyn said. "My lawyer thinks at minimum he loses the position, possibly more depending on what the audit finds." She paused. "It won't undo what he helped Geddes do to 2 other families in this county, but it stops it from continuing." "That's something," Vivian said. It's not enough, Evelyn said, but it's what we have. She looked at the letter again. I've been running this ranch for 19 years. There have been other fights, water, weather, markets, men who thought a woman alone couldn't hold what she'd built. She said this without self-pity, just as fact. This one was different because it wasn't only about me. It was about all of them. She nodded toward the window, and through it the settlement was visible in its morning activity. Smoke from chimneys, the movement of people across the yard, Gregor crossing toward his workshop with a plank under his arm. I want you to know I'm grateful for what you did. The documentation, the journalist, the yard. All of it. The documentation was everyone, Vivian said. The yard was you, Evelyn said. Don't minimize it. Vivian didn't argue. She'd learned that Evelyn Ashcroft gave credit precisely and did not appreciate having it declined. There's one more thing, Evelyn said. She opened the desk drawer and produced a second letter, this one in a different envelope, which she held out across the desk. This came last week. I was waiting to see how the ruling came before I showed you. Vivian took it. The return address was the Millhaven Town Council. She read it. The position at the Millhaven School was still open. The council had heard from the territorial teachers' registry that she was operating a school at Iron Hollow. She had filed the registration in October, a formality but a necessary one. And they were formally renewing their interest. The wages they offered were written out plainly. They were considerably more than she was currently receiving. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it on the desk between them. Tell them thank you, she said. And no. Evelyn looked at her. I knew in October, Vivian said. Nothing's changed. Something's changed, Evelyn said. Meaning coal, meaning the fence line in December, meaning the things that had been moving quietly through the fall and winter that they had not directly discussed, but that Evelyn, who missed very little, had clearly noted. Several things have changed, Vivian said, which is exactly why the answer is still no. Evelyn held her gaze for a moment. Then she made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh Vivian had heard from her. Short, dry, genuine. All right, she said. I'll write them. Whoa. The news spread through Iron Hollow the way good news did, faster than bad news somehow, and with less distortion. People came to find Evelyn or to find each other, and the quality of the day shifted in the way it does when a thing that has been pressing against a community for months suddenly lifts. The Reinhold family produced from somewhere a bottle of schnapps that Mr. Reinhold had apparently been saving for an occasion worthy of it. Dick shook Cole's hand and held it for a moment and didn't say anything, which was the most eloquent thing Vivian had ever seen him do. Kara Finch cried, briefly and without apology, and then went back to the store and reorganized the entire front shelf, which was apparently what she did when she needed to do something with her hands. The children in the school were told at midday, and they responded with the honest immediacy of children, relief they could feel but not quite name, expressed as excitement about something adjacent. The oldest Reinhold girl, who was 12 and understood the situation more than the others, sat very still for a moment and then said, "Does this mean we keep the school?" And Vivian said yes, and the girl nodded once with the particular dignity of someone receiving information they needed very much. "Good," she said, and turned back to her work. Nettie appeared at the school that afternoon, not for an evening lesson, just appeared, in the doorway, after the children had gone. "I heard," she said. "Good news," Vivian said. Nettie came in and sat in her usual back row seat and looked at the chalkboard, which still had the morning's grammar exercise on it. Then she looked at Vivian. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you stay?" she said. "When you first came, you could have left. Everybody could see you could have left." It was the same question Cole had asked her in October, and she had answered it differently then, about building, about needing something to build. Those things were still true. But sitting in the barn school in February with the ruling fresh and the winter light coming through Gregor's south windows, she found a different layer of the answer. Because there's a difference between a place you end up, she said, and a place you choose. She looked at the room around her. The desks, the uneven one with Cole's leather shim, Maisie's handprint still faintly visible on the side of the chalkboard where nobody had the heart to fully clean them. I ended up here, but I chose to stay, and the choosing is the part that makes it yours. Nettie sat with this. I've never chosen anything, she said. Where I went, who I was around, it just happened. I know, Vivian said. And she did know, because she could read the shape of a young woman who had been moved through her own life by other people's decisions, and it was a shape she recognized. But you came here on a Wednesday evening, she said. Nobody made you. Nettie looked at her. That was a choice, Vivian said. Small one, but it counts. The girl looked at the chalkboard for a long moment. Then she said, I'd like to learn numbers next, if that's all right. Thursday evening, Vivian said. We'll start numbers. Nettie stood and nodded and left, and Vivian sat alone in the school for a few minutes in the February afternoon and thought about the particular accumulation of small choices that had brought her to this room. Every one of them uncertain in the moment, every one of them more legible in hindsight. You couldn't know when you were making them which ones would matter. You just had to keep making them and trust that the direction was right. Cole broke ground on the northeast parcel in March, when the ground was soft enough to take it. He'd spent the winter planning, not obsessively, not in a way that took over other work, but steadily, with the same methodical forward thinking that Vivian had come to understand was simply how he operated. He had a vision of it that was not grand. A small horse ranch, 20 acres to start, room to expand if the title fully cleared on the adjacent parcels that Evelyn's lawyer was working through. 6 breeding mares, good bloodlines, manageable scale. Build it so it could sustain itself, not so it looked impressive from the road. Dix helped him dig the first post holes. Gregor volunteered 2 days of framing work, saying only that he'd been wanting to practice certain joints, and this was a good opportunity, which was both true and a kindness. 2 of the Reinhold men came on the first Saturday, and stayed until dark without being asked. Vivian brought lunch on that Saturday, not as a statement just because she was already cooking for the school week and it was practical. And she and Maisie walked out to the northeast parcel and found 6 men driving posts into the cold ground and making the particular kind of conversation that men make when they are working alongside each other, which is mostly not conversation at all, but a shared language of gesture and timing and the kind of trust you build by doing something hard together. Maisie surveyed the scene with proprietary interest. Cole's house? She said. Cole's ranch, Vivian said. Not a house yet. Just the start. Maisie looked at the posts going into the ground, the string lines marking where walls would be. Then she looked at her mother with the expression she sometimes used when she was about to ask a question that was going to require a careful answer. Our house too, she said. Vivian looked at her daughter. 3 years old in April, with her father's eyes and a personality that had arrived fully formed and had been surprising everyone who encountered it ever since. She had been asking questions about Cole with increasing frequency and increasing specificity since December, and Vivian had been answering them honestly and watching her daughter assemble the picture piece by piece with the same systematic thoroughness she'd brought to beetles and letters and the taxonomy of large birds. That's a conversation for later, Vivian said. When later? When you're not standing in someone's future fence line, Vivian said, and picked her up and moved her 6 inches to the left. Maisie accepted this relocation without protest. Okay, she said. But later? Yes, Vivian said. Later. Cole looked over from where he was working and caught the exchange and looked at Vivian with something that was a question and an answer at the same time. And she looked back at him and let him see what she could see in her own face, which was more than she'd shown him so far and which she had decided this morning was appropriate. He turned back to the post, but the set of his shoulders was different for the rest of the afternoon. Teen. Spring came in like it always did in the valley, not all at once, but in pieces, the cold releasing its grip in increments. The school finished its first full term in April, and Vivian sat one evening counting the weeks and found that the 8 children had been attending for 26 consecutive weeks, which was the thing she'd been told was unlikely, and which was, she felt, worth sitting with for a moment before moving forward. She had plans for the second term. More books. She'd written to 4 sources over the winter and had responses from 2, including a donation of 30 primers from a teachers' organization in St. Louis that had read Harrison Flood's article and decided to respond to it in the most practical way available to them. She'd written Flood a letter of thanks, and he'd written back and asked if she'd be willing to be interviewed for a follow-up piece about frontier education, and she'd said yes, because the school needed visibility more than she needed privacy. She had plans for the building too. A proper stove to start. The current one was adequate, but only marginally. A second window on the east wall for the mornings. Desks for 4 more students, because word had reached 2 families on the outer edge of the valley who had children and had not known about the school until recently. Evelyn had approved everything without discussion, which by now was Evelyn's way of indicating strong approval. Maisie turned 3 in April. Vivian made a cake with Mrs. a cake. Paulette's help. It leaned slightly to one side because the stove had a hot spot on the left and she'd misjudged it, and the frosting was uneven, and Maisie declared it the best cake she had ever seen, which was easy to say when you'd only seen a handful of cakes in your life, but which Vivian accepted as the spirit in which it was intended. Cole gave her a carved wooden horse. He'd made it himself. She could tell by the particular patience in the detail work, the way the mane was rendered in careful parallel lines. He gave it to her without ceremony, just held it out and said, "Happy birthday." And Maisie took it and looked at it for a long time with the absolute attention she gave important things. "Cowboy's horse?" she said. "That's your horse," Cole said. "What are you going to call her?" Maisie thought about it with great seriousness. "Maisie Horse," she said. "After yourself?" Vivian said. "My horse," Maisie said, with impeccable logic. Cole looked at Vivian and she looked at him over the head of their daughter. And she thought that word without flinching from it, because by April it was simply accurate. And the ease of it, the ordinary comfort of that shared look across a child's birthday, was the thing she could not have imagined in May of the previous year standing on a platform with a suitcase and $2.60. You couldn't plan for this. You couldn't decide in advance that you would find it. You could only not run from the place where it was growing. He took them back to Carver's Bluff in May. He didn't explain it when he asked, just said he needed to make a supply run, and would they come? And Vivian said yes because she trusted his reasons even when he didn't lead with them. And Maisie said yes because she said yes to most things that involved horses and travel. It was a one-day ride now. The trail she had ridden for 3 days in the opposite direction the previous May. The arroyos and ridgelines and the storm overhang and the canyon camp. She knew in her body now in a way she hadn't known anything in a long time. She knew the rock formation that marked the spring. She knew where the trail narrowed and where it opened, and the exact place where you first saw the valley floor spreading below you when you came in from the east. Maisie, 3 years old and considerably more experienced in the saddle than she'd been at 2, rode in front of Cole now. This had been her decision, made gradually and incrementally over the winter, and it was where she preferred to be. She held the saddle horn with one hand and held her carved wooden horse with the other, and she narrated the journey to both of them with the authority of an experienced traveler. "Rock," she said. "That rock." "You remember that rock?" Vivian said, from her own horse riding beside them. "Big rock," Maisie said, "from before." She didn't, in any literal sense, remember it. She'd been 2 and asleep for part of the journey, and the specificity of the memory was not the point. But she had absorbed the landscape the way young children absorb things they move through, and something in her recognized the shape of it. Vivian found this both remarkable and entirely characteristic. They arrived in Carver's Bluff in the late morning. The town looked the same. The general store, the hotel, the street with its particular dust and its particular business. Cole made the supply arrangements he'd mentioned and left the goods to be loaded while they ate at a lunch counter near the hotel. And Maisie ate half a corn cake and gave the rest to Cole without explanation. And then Cole walked them to the train station. Vivian understood when they came around the corner and she saw the platform. She stopped walking for just a moment, just a half-step pause that she recovered from before Maisie noticed. And something went through her that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude and was probably both. The platform was the same. The hand-lettered sign above the door. The bench at the far end where she'd sat in the full sun with her suitcase at her feet and watched the train pull away. The station master's office window through which she could see the current occupant, not the same man, a younger one, working at his desk without looking up. Cole stopped in the middle of the platform. He looked at Vivian. "I wanted to come back here," he said, "with you, on this day." She looked at him. Why today? Because it was a year ago today, he said. Give or take a day. I'm not exact on the date. He paused. But close. She stood on the platform where she had sat in the worst afternoon she could remember and felt the whole of the year between, every day of it, the trail and the storm and the barn and the yard and the fence line in December and the ruling in February and a child's birthday cake that leaned to the left. And she could not have said, if asked, whether the year had been long or short, only that it had been real in a way that most of her life before it had not been, that she had been present in it, that she had made choices, one after another, that she did not regret. Maisie looked at the platform with her traveler's assessment. Train place, she said. Yes, Vivian said. This is where we came, the first day. A year ago. Maisie considered this. Before the ranch? Before everything, Vivian said. The little girl stood on the wooden platform and looked around at it, and then looked at Cole, who was crouching down to her level, which he did when he had something to say to her directly. Maisie recognized this and gave him her full attention, the Maisie attention that was total and slightly unnerving in a 3-year-old. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes, she said. Do you know what it means, he said carefully, to have a father? Maisie looked at him. She was 3 years old. She had a vocabulary that amazed most adults who spoke with her, and a comprehension of her own situation that was partial, but not as partial as people assumed. She knew her papa had gone away before she could remember him, because Vivian had told her this honestly, in the simple, clear language that children deserve. She knew that Cole was at the ranch, and that he came to the school, and that he had given her a wooden horse, and that he held her hand when she asked him to, and that she had, at some point in the preceding months, decided that he was hers in a way she didn't have a complete word for yet. Like Mama's papa, she said. Yes, he said. Like that. Someone who stays. She looked at him for a long moment. The platform was quiet around them. A bird on the depot roof, the distant sound of the street, the ordinary afternoon of a small frontier town going about its business entirely indifferent to the 3 people standing on its train platform. You stay? Maisie said. I want to, he said, if you'll let me. She thought about it. The thinking was visible on her face, genuine deliberation, the kind she brought to questions that mattered. Then she looked at her mother, and Vivian nodded, and that was apparently what she needed, because she turned back to Cole and threw her arms around his neck and held on with the complete, unhesitating force of a child who has decided. He held her, his eyes closed for a moment. Just a moment. When he set her down and stood up, Maisie picked up her wooden horse from where she'd set it on the platform and went to investigate the station master's window, which had things in it she wanted to look at. Cole looked at Vivian. She was not going to make him ask in a grand way that didn't fit either of them, and she suspected he knew this, but she was also not going to preempt him, because he deserved to do it. Vivian, he said. Yes, she said. He held her gaze. I'm asking. I know you are, she said. Yes. Something moved across his face that she'd never seen there before. A complete unguarded thing, open in a way that a man who had spent years keeping himself defended against the consequences of his own history does not easily allow. She saw it fully, and she let him see that she did, and neither of them looked away. Yes, she said again, because it was worth saying twice. He reached out and took her hand. Not the formal hand-holding of ceremony, just her hand in his, standing on a train platform in Carver's Bluff. The same platform where she had sat a year ago with $2.60 and no plan, and nothing going in the direction it was supposed to go. Maisie came back from the window. She looked at their joined hands. She looked up at both of them with the expression of someone confirming that the information she's been working with is accurate. Okay, she said with satisfaction, and put her hand on top of theirs, the small wooden horse still in her fist. They stood like that on the platform for a moment, the 3 of them, the afternoon light doing what it did in this country, hard and honest and without apology. And Vivian thought that this was the thing nobody told you about starting over. They told you it was possible. They told you it took courage. What they didn't tell you was that it didn't feel like starting over at all. It felt like arriving. Like you had been traveling toward a place you didn't have a name for, and then one day you were standing in it, and you recognized it not because it was what you'd imagined, but because it was better than that. It was real. They were married in June, in the yard at Iron Hollow, in the way of frontier settlements where ceremony is practical and brief, and the reception afterward is longer and louder and more meaningful than the ceremony itself. It was not a perfect wedding. The morning was windy and blew over two of the arrangements Mrs. Paulette had spent considerable effort constructing. Maisie was supposed to hold a small bunch of flowers and instead conducted an extended investigation of Gregor's boot buckles throughout the proceedings. One of the Reinhold children began crying for reasons unrelated to the event and had to be removed briefly. The territorial judge who performed the ceremony had a cold and was visibly miserable about it. Cole said his words clearly and looked at Vivian when he said them, and she said hers the same way. And when it was done, Maisie tugged on Cole's sleeve and said, "Done?" And he said, "Done." And she said, "Good," with the finality of someone who has been patient long enough. The yard filled up. 31 people and then some. 2 families from the outer valley edge had come, the ones with the children who'd be starting school in the fall. And Flood the journalist had sent a letter of congratulation that Vivian read aloud because she thought it would make people laugh, and it did. And Evelyn Ashcroft stood at the edge of the gathering with a cup of something and watched it all with the expression that was not quite a smile, but that Vivian had learned to read as the version of happiness that someone carries when they have been through enough to know exactly what they're looking at. Nettie danced, which surprised everyone, including Nettie. Dix gave a toast that was 6 words long and entirely sufficient. Mrs. Paulette had made 3 pies, all of them level, and when Vivian pointed this out, she said, "Of course they're level," in a tone that suggested the alternative had never been a possibility. The ranch at the northeast parcel took its first horses in August, 6 mares, as Cole had planned, with bloodlines he'd researched through the winter. The first foal arrived in September, a bay with 1 white ankle, and Maisie named it Maisie 2, which Cole accepted without visible objection. The school opened its second term with 12 students. Nettie had, over the summer, advanced to a reading level that Vivian described to Evelyn as genuinely impressive, and had begun helping with the younger students on Thursday evenings in a way that suggested teaching was something she was going to be good at if someone kept making space for it. Vivian was making space for it. The land title on the northeast parcel cleared in October, clean and final, and Cole put the document in the box where he kept the things that mattered, next to a letter from a prison chaplain and a contract from a woman named Evelyn Ashcroft, dated 6 years earlier. Evelyn herself was slower that fall. Nothing acute, nothing alarming, but the years of the ranch in her joints and in the way she moved, and she had begun, quietly and without naming it as such, to shift certain decisions toward Cole in a way that he noticed and that Vivian noticed, and that they did not discuss directly but both understood. She had built something that would outlast her, which had been the point, and she was beginning to let it. The boundary dispute ruling was never appealed. Geddes sold 3 of his southern parcels in September to a buyer from California and was not seen in the valley again. The land office audit resulted in Cotter's termination in November and a referral to the territorial attorney that was still ongoing. 2 of the families whose disputes had been wrongly decided against them were in the process of contesting those decisions, and Evelyn's lawyer was helping them with the documentation at no charge, because Evelyn had decided this was the appropriate use of what they'd learned. Justice, as it turned out, was not a single moment. It was a series of decisions made by people who continued to show up and do the work even after the most dramatic part was over. On the last evening of October, Vivian sat on the front step of the house they had built on the northeast parcel. Not yet finished, there was still siding to go on the north wall, and the kitchen had a temporary partition where the proper one would be, but livable, genuinely livable. And she watched the valley in the last of the autumn light. Cole was in the paddock with the mares. She could hear him, not his words, just his voice, the low, steady tone he used with horses, which was the same tone he used with Maisie when she was overtired, and the same tone he'd used on a train platform when he'd crouched down and asked a 3-year-old for permission to stay. Maisie was at her feet, working through a page of letters with a slate pencil. The carving was wearing off the letters, but she knew them well enough now that she was beginning to combine them into words, which she treated as a new game, and played with the same intense interest she brought to everything. M, she said, writing. AI. That's your name starting, Vivian said. My name, Maisie agreed and added the S and the I and the E with the careful, slightly excessive pressure of a child still learning to control the stylus. She held it up. Lopsided, legible. Hers. Good, Vivian said. Maisie looked at it for a moment, satisfied, and then erased it and started again, because the point at 3 was not the product, but the doing. Cole came out of the paddock and latched the gate and came to the step and sat beside Vivian. He smelled like horses and the particular cold of October evenings and the sawdust that never entirely left his jacket from the ongoing work on the north wall. She didn't move over to make room. There was room. Just let him settle in beside her and felt the solid, ordinary fact of him there. Maisie's writing her name, she said. I can see that, he said, watching the slate. Again, Maisie said, without looking up, confirming that she was aware of her audience. They watched her write it again. Better this time. The S was still uncertain, but the rest of it was clear and deliberate, the letters landing where she meant them to. She held it up. Good? She said, to Cole specifically. Real good, he said. She accepted this and erased it again and started the third attempt, apparently aiming for a standard she hadn't reached yet. Vivian leaned slightly against Cole's shoulder, and he didn't shift to accommodate it. Just let it be. And the valley went about its late October business around them. The horses in the paddock, the lights coming on across the settlement in the early dark, the sound of the Reinhold family's evening somewhere in the middle distance, someone calling a name, someone answering. She thought about what she would tell someone, if asked, about what the year had taught her, not about frontier life or land law or the mechanics of building a school in a barn. About the other things, the things underneath. She thought she would say this, that the worst days of your life are not wasted, not because they make you stronger in the way people like to say. That's too clean, too purposeful, too much like a lesson that was designed in advance for your benefit. But because they are still yours. They are still the days you lived, and the choices you made in them, and the person you were on the platform with the suitcase is the same person who built the school and stood in the yard and said yes on a train platform in May with a child's hand on top of hers. You don't leave her behind. You carry her forward and she carries you, and that continuity, that unbroken line of a self that kept going, is the thing that can't be taken. She thought she would say that belonging is not a thing you find. It is a thing you build, badly and incrementally, and with other people's help, and it looks nothing like you imagined it would look, and it is better. She thought she would say that a person who is willing to keep making the next choice, not the perfect choice, not the brave choice, just the next honest one, is not lost, even when it feels like it. Even on the worst platform of the worst afternoon, something is always coming around the corner. Sometimes it's a man on a dark bay horse who removes his hat. Sometimes it's just a direction, just a hand extended, just a letter that says, I believe you may be practical, and means underneath, I see you, and I think you're worth the trouble. You say yes. You get on the horse, you find out what's on the other side of the 3-day ride. Mama, Maisie said. I wrote it good this time. Vivian looked. She had. The letters were even and clear, and each one was where it was supposed to be, and it said exactly who she was. Yes, Vivian said. You did. Maisie examined her own work with the critical eye of someone who would erase it and try again anyway. Then she looked up at the valley, and at the lights, and at her mother and the man beside her, and she seemed to find the picture complete. Okay, she said, and erased the slate clean. The valley held them in the dark.